here who know Turkey probably far better than I do. I've never lived in the country, but I have been on the European Parliament's delegation to Turkey for the last 11 years. And so I've been backwards and forwards, and I've got to know quite a lot of senior politicians. From my previous experience, I knew generals in the Turkish army. On the other side of the divide, if you like, I attended the trial of Orhan Pamuk, who many of you will know is a very well-known Turkish author. So I try to cover the whole gamut, if you like. And I was last in Turkey about 3 or 4 weeks ago, so one tries to keep very much up to date. I remember when I was a young officer, and a very senior general, just been commissioned. There I was as young second lieutenant, and the senior general said to me, Geoffrey, let me give you 3 pieces of advice. He said, the first is, you're setting out on your military career here, the first is, never march on Moscow. The second, never entrust your baggage to the Royal Air Force. And the third is make sure the Turks are on your side. So I always remembered those little bits of advice as I went through my various careers. The other very personal connection we had is that Fanny and I got married on the 20th of July 1974. Now, all of you will know, of course, that that is the date when Turkey invaded northern Cyprus. And I always impressed my Greek and Turkish friends by knowing precisely that date. It was a Saturday, and I could tell them all about it. And we actually had planned a honeymoon in Corfu, which is a Greek island, of course. And when we went to the airport, we found that the airspace over both Greece and Turkey was closed because these two countries were almost at war together. We never got to Corfu. We ended up in a caravan in Saint-Tropez. That's another story, but it seems to have done us no harm. Caroline's asked me to say a few words about Turkey's relationship with the West. My goodness, you see, that's a big topic. One could go back to 330 AD, when Constantine set up the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire in Constantinople. One looks at that marvelous, what was a great cathedral in Constantinople, Hagia Sophia, that was built originally from 300 AD, burnt down, rebuilt in 500 AD. Or perhaps more relevantly, one could think about 1453, when the Ottomans captured Constantinople, and it became Istanbul, and then became for many years until 1923 was the capital of the Ottoman Empire. Or one could think more recently, the Crimean War, of course, 1855, or indeed the First World War, when the Turks were on the wrong side, and the Second World War, when very sensibly they remained neutral. So there's a lot of background, if you like, in terms of relationships between the West and Turkey. But here we are in the United States, and you might say to yourself, well, it's a long way away. What interest is it to the United States? We've been at war with most countries in the world. Turkey is one of those countries where you haven't been at war with Turkey. In fact, Turkey has, I think, great significance for you. When we look around, I mean, we look at the American population, for example, it actually has quite a small population of Turkish origin. I think the figure is about 120, 130,000, which in terms of the US is quite small. There are 1 or 2 quite famous Americans of Turkish origin. Muhtar Kent, for example, who's the president and CEO of Coca-Cola, comes from that particular background. But I think more significantly, if we look, what is the importance of Turkey to the United States? Well, of course, Turkey has been a NATO ally since 1952. It sat right at the front end, if you like, of the Cold War confrontation with the Soviet Union, because, of course, at that stage, it had a border with the Soviet Union. If you look at we really ought to have some maps here, but if one looks at the geographical position of Turkey, You can see it's of key geostrategic significance. Just look at the countries which border on Turkey at the moment. Iraq, Syria, Iran, Georgia, and then of course you come around to Bulgaria and Greece. But I mean, a key area of significance, I think, for the United States. Turkey sits geographically also at a very key position in terms of its command of the Bosporus. I don't know how many of you have actually been to Turkey, but those that have been there will know the significance of the Bosporus. It is a small waterway. It's 20 miles long. It's not much wider than some of the rivers that you have just flowing through Charleston and that just here. And yet it's a most vital waterway. It has something like 100 oil tankers a week go through the Bosporus. It is Russia's main exit from the Black Sea into the Mediterranean. Historically, it's always been of enormous importance, and the great powers have always fought over control of the Bosporus and not wanting others to control that particular waterway. So that's of, I think, great strategic significance. Turkey also is becoming an energy hub. I say this because Turkey doesn't have natural resources of her own, but she is sitting in that crossroads between sources of oil and gas and the West. And I'm thinking in particular of the new oil fields and gas fields which have been developed in the Caspian, in Azerbaijan and places like that. How do you get that material out? What's going to be the route? Is it going to be under Russian control? Or are there going to be alternative pipelines? That is one of the big arguments that's going on at the moment. And of course, Turkey is right at the hub of that, because potentially she already has pipelines that are coming down from Baku down to Ceyhan on the Mediterranean coast. And they're talking about pipelines that will go across into Europe. There is an interconnector between Turkey and Greece. There is actually a pipeline between Tabriz in Iran and Turkey. And that's another interesting connection. I think when we look back in terms of the relationship between the United States and Turkey, in the past, I think Turkey's been regarded as yet another, if you like, client state. That at the time of the Cold War, there was Turkey right in that front line, in need of protection, in need of the great power of the United States, if you like. But of course, in 1989, all that changed. And I would say really the boot's on the other foot now. And I think Turkey is a very interesting case in point. It is a middle-ranging power, or a middle-sized power, that the United States needs to be far more sensitive to their needs and requirements, and needs to calibrate far more carefully the relationship between a country like Turkey and the United States, and needs therefore to understand it. And bear in mind, you haven't had an ambassador there now for the last 3 months, and you haven't yet approved the nominee for the ambassadorship. That doesn't mean you're not represented, but it does mean that figurehead of your embassy, E-man, isn't actually there. So I think all that is vitally important. When we look at Turkey today, we see shifts in relationships, and some of them are quite worrying. We have a governing party, the AK Party, the Justice and Development Party, which has been in power since 2002. And many people say, is this an Islamist party? And bear in mind that in Turkey, for the last 90 years, there's been this tussle between the forces of westernization, the forces of secularism, the forces of modernization. Each of those is not necessarily mutually exclusive, but quite often you find that political relationships are defined in terms of those particular characteristics. And you have a party in power at the moment that would say yes, it is committed to the Western vocation of Turkey. Yes, it is very much committed to modernization, but it wants to see that modernization of Turkey as very much an Islamic country. Now, of course, we live in times where there are serious problems between the great democracies and much of the, what I would call the Muslim world. Turkey is absolutely vital in this. It is, or has for a long time been, the only Muslim country that was a member of NATO and that has been firmly aligned to the West. What happens in Turkey is symbolic for so many other countries. When they see this relationship and how Turkey is treated, they will try and define their own relationship with all of us. So I think it's very important from that point of view. The party that's in power at the moment, I say the Justice and Development Party, they've alarmed some people because in recent weeks and months in particular, they've started taking foreign policy positions which seem to be unhelpful as far as Western or in particular United States policy positions are concerned. And I think particularly of the relationship with Israel. Now, of course, when we think about Israel, we think very much of the United States. And what happens to Israel is very much a reflection on attitudes to the United States. And the fact is that as far as Turkey was concerned, I mean, after the Second World War, when Israel was created as an independent country, Turkey initially was a little bit apprehensive because the Russians, the Soviet Union at that time, had been the first to recognize this new state of Israel, and they thought that Israel was going to be very much in the Soviet sort of camp. But that didn't last very long. And very rapidly, Turkey realized that here was a potentially very good ally, as we saw these other Arab countries becoming increasingly under Soviet influence, the Syrias, the Egypts, and the Iraqs of this world. So over the years, we saw a very strong strategic relationship develop between Israel and Turkey, an intelligence relationship, a military relationship in terms of training and equipment and expertise, and indeed an economic relationship as well. But in the last couple of years, that relationship seems to have frayed. And I think we have to ask ourselves, well, what's going on there? Now, I have to say I'm a friend of Turkey, I'm a friend of Israel as well. And my Israeli friends say to me, oh, well, Geoffrey, you know, they're a bunch of Islamists, and this has been going on for a long time, and, you know, just nothing we can do about it. And I'm not sure, ladies and gentlemen, it's quite that simple. Certainly, Prime Minister Erdogan, he wanted to retain all of these good, strong relationships with the West, and indeed with Israel, but at the same time, to develop strong relationships with the rest of the Arab world. And there's nothing unnatural about that. After all, this was Turkey's historic backyard, if you like. And isn't it natural that you'd want to have good relations with all your neighbours, particularly when you were becoming increasingly reliant on some of them for things like energy resources? So, you know, if I was looking out from Ankara today, I would say, well, of course it makes sense to have improved relations with these other countries. This shouldn't in any way imperil our relationship with the West, or in any way undermine our attitude to the West. But of course others don't quite read it in that way. And there have been one or two incidents in relation to Israel which have been particularly poignant. And the most recent of those, of course, was the Mavi Marmara flotilla that went to, if you know, to break the blockade on Gaza, and this left from Turkish ports. And of course there were a number of Turkish casualties in that particular action. And I think you have to wind back just a little bit and remember that in 2008, the Israelis had developed very good relationships with the Turks. The Turks were actually bridging talks between Israel and Syria. And then just at that moment, you had the action against Gaza by the Israelis. And this absolutely enraged the Turks, because they said, well, you know, there we are talking to you, being helpful. You didn't tell us anything about this, that you were going to do this. And of course, that alarmed the Arab world, and the Turkish government spoke very strongly against the Israeli action. So that set the scene, if you like. Then you had this business with this flotilla of ships leaving Istanbul, and all the action from that. And of course, there's been a very serious breakdown now of relationships between Turkey and Israel, to the extent that a few days ago, Israel even started having military exercises with Greece, which is something which they've never done before. Now, all I would say is, look, it's in everybody's interest to get these two countries back together again. And there needs to be some sorting out. It's easy for me to stand here and say it in these terms, but there's some serious work that needs to go on to get over these particular differences. Now, I have to be careful on my time, because I know I'm all right now. But, well, so I've talked a little bit about why I think Turkey is important for the United States, because whatever your sort of historic lack of interest in Turkey, I would suggest that today, Turkey is right at the fulcrum of US interests in the Middle East. Actually, it goes beyond that, because we're talking about the Caucasus. And actually, if we go up now to Central Asia, you're talking about the stans there, many of which are of Turkic origin. And the Turks would like to think they have a special lien, a special connection with many of those countries. And don't forget, if you want to supply Afghanistan, then you're going to be relying on certainly Uzbekistan and maybe Turkmenistan to help you get into Afghanistan. And when you've got problems elsewhere, as we've seen, you might come to rely on those particular countries. And Turkey can be extremely helpful as far as that's concerned. And I think if we look all around the Middle East, Iran, for example, that of course is of key importance for all of us. Turkey again has a special relationship there. She's very worried about Iran, by the way. I mean, if you talk, on the one hand, you have the public face of Turkey, where they're saying things which we might be uncomfortable with. But when you talk more privately with some senior Turks, they'll say, well, actually, we're scared stiff of Iran. You know, and we're just trying to get it sorted. So I would suggest that Turkey is a country that the United States needs to take far more interest in. Now, I'm a member of the European Parliament, a very dodgy institution, and I certainly don't approve of much that it gets up to. In fact, quite a lot of what it gets up to. In fact, I spend a lot of my time fighting against much of what it does. But one of the good things which the European Union happens to have done is enlarge. And of course, one of the candidates for enlargement now, and of course the European Union now comprises 27 member states, and there are a number of other countries that want to join. And the most significant and most controversial of these is, of course, Turkey. Now, you know, why is it controversial? Well, the size of Turkey. Turkey, by the way, is about the same size as Texas, but about 3 times the population. About 90 million or so at the moment. In a few years' time, it was calculated it'll be 120 million. If Turkey were to join the European Union, it would be the most populous country in the European Union. That has all sorts of consequences. The relative poverty of the country. Caroline mentioned earlier about Istanbul and the sophistication of parts of Istanbul, and indeed that is right, and you could argue that there are 2 countries in Turkey. You've got this very sophisticated sort of eastern shore of Istanbul and all around there, and then you've got the great heartland of Anatolia, where the world is entirely different. And many people say, you know, when the East looks at Turkey, they think of a Western country. When the West looks at Turkey, we think of an Eastern country. And I think it is very much a country of 2 halves. So, and there is a lot of poverty and very great backwardness in parts of Turkey. So that's another reason why there's this reticence about Turkish accession to the European Union. It's going to cost a lot of money. But I think also there's another aspect to this. Migration is a big question. I know here we are in the United States, you are a country of migrants. You're a country of, Sam Huntington would call you settlers, and others would say immigrants. But here this is what you're all about. But bear in mind, Europe's different to that, and it is very controversial. The migration and immigration that's going on in Europe from other cultures. And of course, when people look at Turkey, they think, my goodness, if they were to join the European Union as a normal member, that would mean ultimately there would be free movement of people between Turkey and all the other countries of the European Union. And given all the problems that many of us are having with migration issues, is that something that they really want to take on? So there is that great concern as well. And then the other side of the coin is the nature of the European Union itself. Now there are certain people, and with all due respect to Felix, the Germans and the French, they have a certain idea of Europe which they see as their European Union. And they see a certain finality to it. It shouldn't get much bigger than it is. It is distinctly European, and it's got very much a sort of Franco-German imprint on it, if you like. The idea that Turkey would come into this would change it dramatically. And that's why they accuse people like me of being mischievous. And they say, oh, well, Geoffrey, of course we know the reason you want Turkey in the European Union because it would ruin the European Union. I say, well, that's not quite true, but nevertheless, there is a point to this. This idea of the finalité of the European Union, somehow or other they don't quite see Turkey fitting into that. But the fact is, Turkey originally applied to join the European Union in the mid-60s, 1965. It's quite a long time ago. It took until 1995, well, there was a customs union with Turkey. Then in 1999, Turkey became a candidate for the European Union. So it took 30 years for them to go from applying to being recognized as a candidate. And once you're a candidate, you acquire all sorts of status and things like that. Things move on a bit. So in 1999, Turkey became a candidate. In 2005, negotiations were opened. Now, you can see there's a bit of foot dragging that goes on here. 2005 negotiations were opened. Well, here we are, 5 years on from that, and negotiations are moving at a snail's pace. And when I say negotiations, I have to say, we're talking about what they call chapters, 30 chapters of negotiation, environment, agriculture, economy, you can imagine all the titles of the chapters, each one of those separately negotiated. Bear in mind what I was saying about the importance of Turkey as an energy hub. We haven't opened the chapter on energy. And I'm constantly getting up in the European Parliament and saying what a disgrace this is, that this is being blocked. And the reason it's being blocked is because there's a dispute, of course, between Turkey and Cyprus and the whole future of Cyprus. And every time there is some good movement in a certain direction as far as Turkey is concerned, then you find that things are blocked. I mean, I realize I'm opening up a controversial point here, which I'm happy to take on. But this is one of the explanations for why things are running at such a snail's pace. When they opened negotiations in 2005, already they laid down certain ground rules. And they said, yes, we'll open negotiations, but bear in mind, there will be certain exceptions. There will be derogations. There will be safeguard clauses. These could be put in on a permanent basis. In other words, even if all the negotiations are successfully concluded, Turkey would never be 100% the same sort of member as every other member of the European Union, because there would be some permanent restrictions, if you like, that would be imposed. So I think we need to bear that in mind. I mean, I say I'm a friend of Turkey. I take a very positive view of Turkey's accession negotiations. I think it would be very foolish of us at this moment, when we have all the problems that we have with the Muslim world, when Turkey is a country that's been a good Western ally since the 1950s, and in fact, Mustafa Kemal, who created modern Turkey, since the 1920s, has had this Western orientation for Turkey. Are we really saying that at this moment in all of our histories, when we have so many difficulties in the world, and it's such a dangerous place, that we want to slam the door in the face of a country like Turkey? And I would say not, and therefore I encourage the European Union to take a more forward-looking, generous view of Turkish accession, and I would encourage the United States to take a little bit more interest and care and sensitivity when dealing with countries like Turkey. And I think I'm going to stop there, so there's going to be time for questions. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.
Can you say a few more words about the Cypriot situation? Why?
A little louder, please.
It's a question about the situation in Cyprus.
Why would Cyprus still be an issue sufficient enough to be a blocking factor to the European Union?
Cyprus, of course, was part of the Ottoman Empire. It became British in 1878. In the 1950s, and of course the majority of the population on the island of Cyprus is of Greek origin, but there is a very significant Turkish Cypriot community as well. The figures are about 70-30, something like that. In the 1950s, there was a very strong move on the part of the Greek Cypriots to unite with Greece. And of course this alarmed the Turkish Cypriots, who resisted that. And cut a long story short, when the British gave independence to Cyprus in 1960, it was on a very strict basis. There would be guarantor powers, namely the United Kingdom, Greece and Turkey. The negotiations were carried out between those three powers and the Greek Cypriots and the Turkish Cypriots. There was a constitution put in place that recognized the fact that the island of Cyprus had two very distinct communities, Greek Cypriot and Turkish Cypriot. And there were checks and balances and safeguards in that constitution, 1960. Now, 3 years later, that constitution was more or less overthrown, because the Greek Cypriots were not content. The relationship between the two communities deteriorated until you got to the stage of the moment of our wedding in 1974, when in fact what prompted the Turkish invasion of northern Cyprus was the fact that there was an attempted coup d'etat. At this time you had the generals were in charge in Greece. They were in cahoots with a bunch of thugs in Cyprus, ex-EOKA terrorists, led by a chap called Nikos Sampson, that the British had sentenced to death and very foolishly pardoned him. And then he popped up again in 1974 and led this coup. And that was the thing that really provoked the Turks. And they thought, my goodness, if this lot take over, then we've had it. So in they came. And so the Turkish army arrived in force and occupied the northern part of the island. And that's the situation that we have. Of course, there was international outrage at the Turkish action. The United States imposed an arms embargo against Turkey and all that. The bitterness runs very deep, and mutual suspicion runs very deep. There's a very strong, I would say, and with all due respect to any Greeks or Greek Cypriots who are here, but I do think that the Greeks have reinterpreted the history of the last few decades in their own interests and succeeded in selling a view of the Cyprus situation which was wholly to their advantage. And so we've been left with this isolated element of northern Cyprus, cut off from the world, isolated, no one recognizes except Turkey, and left in a sort of limbo. Now, the crucial stage came when in 2004, the Republic of Cyprus, which is really Greek Cyprus, was allowed to join the European Union. I wouldn't have allowed this, because one of the elements of joining the European Union is that you've resolved all your disputes with your neighbours. That you don't import into the European Union sort of historic entities and things. And yet here was a classic case where nothing had been resolved. And they came in, and at the same time that they joined, the European Union also said, and we will end the isolation of northern Cyprus. But as soon as the Greek Cypriots were in the European Union, they immediately blocked any further move on that. And so the isolation of northern Cyprus continues. Well, it's gone on from there. There was an Annan plan, the United Nations plan for the reunification of the island. Ironically, the Turkish Cypriots, reluctantly, but they voted in favour of this. It was rejected by the Greek Cypriots. And who was knocked on the head? The Turkish Cypriots. So, I just think that there is a lot of enmity there, and the trouble is, in the European Union, you've got Greece and you've got Cyprus. Both have sort of blocking vetoes, if you like, on progress in this whole area. And it does affect things like relationships in NATO, and it goes beyond that. So it has very deep and complex, I mean, I'm oversimplifying, but complex historic roots. But somehow or other, again, I do think this is an area the United States has neglected. I don't think they gave enough attention to this particular problem at a time when the United States had real clout in the area. So, again, this needs to be addressed. It's not in any of our interests that it continues in this sort of way. So.
Maybe there's a short answer to this question, but I don't know the answer. I'm curious the impact or the significance of Al-Qaeda in Turkey, say in comparison to a situation like in Pakistan. You have some comments about the significance of that influence in Turkey?
Yeah. It's very difficult to judge, first of all, the sort of Islamist influence. By that I mean political Islam. Separate from that, and related to it, of course, is Al-Qaeda. There have been Turks who've gone to Afghanistan and Pakistan for training, but there are a lot of Brits, of course, and we've got some Americans. But there are Turks, several hundred are known to have done that. There have been Al-Qaeda-linked terrorist attacks in Turkey. Don't forget, Turkey for a long time has had a problem from PKK, Kurdish terrorism. But more recently, there have been Al-Qaeda attacks as well. Most significantly, I think it was in 2005, the attack on the 4 targets, 2 synagogues, HSBC Bank, and the British consulate in Istanbul. And the British Consul General, Roger Short, was killed in that attack. And there were about 60 dead in that attack. That was Al-Qaeda. About 3 years later, I think it was 2008, there was an attack on the US consulate in Istanbul, and there were 6 deaths. I think there were three of the terrorists and 3 Turkish security guards were killed. So there have been attacks in Turkey. I mentioned the Mavi Marmara flotilla, the ship and the flotilla to break the Gaza blockade. That was sponsored by a charity, IHH. That charity, some have said, has dubious links with terrorists and extremists, possibly Al-Qaeda, but I mean that's not something I can perfectly validate. Some have that view. And of course there is, I think more significantly, there is a lot of sympathy for what people like Al-Qaeda get up to in all of those countries. And the United States is very unpopular. 75% disapproved of the Iraq invasion, only 20% in a recent opinion poll supportive of United States policy positions. So there has been an Al-Qaeda presence. There is some fertile ground there, which again brings me back to the point that this is where we need to take great care. Please.
Does Turkey still have a problem with Kurds? What's that
Yes.
situation? That would have
Does Turkey have a problem still with the Kurds? Slightly less than they did have. Historically, that area of northern Iraq, which is a Kurdish area, had been part of the Ottoman Empire, of course, and then you've got a Kurdish population in southeastern Turkey. One of the reasons why Turkey opposed the US intervention in Iraq's second Gulf War was because they said, this is not in Turkey's interest. That country's going to pull apart. We're going to end up with Kurdish, Kurdish northern Iraq that's going to want to link up with a bit of Turkey. We don't want that. The PKK, of course, was a creature of the Cold War. It was of Soviet origin. It was funded and armed by the Soviet Union. When the Cold War came to an end, of course, that started to diminish, but then they found new footholds. They continue to be active. The present government in Turkey has reached out to the Kurdish population more. They now allow Kurdish language on the Kurdish radio stations and things like that. There's a greater recognition of Kurdish cultural and linguistic interests. So there has been a return. There are a lot of Kurdish members of parliament, particularly in the AK party, but also in one or two other parties as well. It is still a problem. It is potentially a problem that could reignite, but it's slightly quieter at the moment than it has been. So.
I believe there's a population of about 2.5 million Turks in Germany, the holdover from when Germany needed labor after World War II. And I understand, I think Prime Minister Merkel announced or said something about the fact that they're not assimilating foreigners very well in Germany. Do you have any comments on that and the whole general aspect of the 2.5 million right in the heart of Germany?
I would let Felix answer that.
Did you say that they are assimilating well? Or
I believe she said they are not.
She said
exactly. Exactly. It's ended. That's what she said.
I think the problem has been that in the past, of course, it was very difficult for Turks to obtain German citizenship. And they were regarded as a sort of a transient population. That has changed now, and indeed there are a number of German members of the European Parliament of Turkish origin, and some quite surprising ones who sit in the sort of socialist group and things like that, who are sort of very prosperous businessmen and things like that. And I said, well, why on earth are you in this socialist group? You're in the wrong bit. And they said, look, Geoffrey, you've got to understand, if you're in Germany, the only party people of Turkish origin can vote for is the SPD, the Socialist Party, because of course the Conservative Party, the Christian Democrats, has been in the past vehemently against them. And of course it is one of the factors in this whole question of Turkey's accession. So to what extent can people from other cultures be assimilated into our country? So it's a burning issue at the moment. Please.
Can you talk a little bit more about
Turkey's view of the United States, and has that changed with the new administration that came in 2 years ago?
The question is about Turkey's view of the United States. I've mentioned some opinion polling that shows, I'm always a bit skeptical about opinion polls, as you all know. You can ask the question however you like and torture a statistic long enough and it'll give you whatever answer you want. But it would seem that it's fairly well established that the United States is not terribly popular in countries like Turkey at the moment. One of the big reasons for that, I think, is the whole Iraq question. This was very, very controversial. We remember at the time of the first Iraq War, the Turkish government was very cooperative, was a good ally of the United States. Attacks on Iraq were launched from Turkish air bases. Turkey imposed an embargo on Iraq to their own economic detriment, I have to say, because they were very reliant on Iraqi oil. Second time round, government said, yeah, well, all right, you can allow American troops in, but when it went to the Parliament said no. And so there was a block. And I think that was a reflection, really, of how people more widely in Turkey were regarding this. They think the Iraq War, well, I mean, a lot of people think it was a disaster. They regard it as a disaster. It has not helped Turkey. And the idea that somehow or other the United States was merely attacking another Muslim country and all that has a great traction among the sort of ordinary people in a country like Turkey, I'm afraid. And that's why I say there's work to be done to overcome a lot of these ideas. So, yeah, I think and also, of course, the association with Israel, the way people have looked at what's happened in Gaza and all that has come back. And then the Mavi Marmara incident, there were Turkish casualties, that created a big outcry. So, yeah, the US does not get a good press in Turkey generally. Please.
I was in Turkey in April, and I noticed a lot more women covering their hair and wearing long burqas or robes than I had expected, even when I heard about Turkey being oriented westward. And we talked to some friends of ours who live in Turkey, and one is a woman who's the chairman of an academic medical department at a university, and she said, no matter how well I treat my patients, no matter how much I publish, no matter how well I administer this department, I cannot advance my career because I'm a woman. I wondered if you had any insight on it. And other people had said that women don't necessarily want to veil, but they feel they have to, so their husbands can keep their jobs or things like that.
Yeah. I mean, I think this is really about the veil, and I think it's a very interesting and very controversial question. I personally have strong views on this. I don't like to see it in our own culture, but on the other hand, I'm a man of freedom and liberty and personal expression and all that, and I want to safeguard those rights. So trying to get the thing in balance. I always say to people, I used to see more veils at Heathrow Terminal 3 than I did in Istanbul. Bear in mind that the veil was banned in Turkey in 1937 in sixth forms, in universities, and in government offices. You could not enter the civil service or military or any of those sorts of things if you come out of one of these religious schools, what they now call the Imam Hatip schools. There were, the army, of course, was always this great block on a resurgence of Islamism. And many people see the veil as not a religious thing, not a modesty thing, but as a political symbol. And I think for a lot of people it is. I mean, Turkish, many will say to me, yeah, of course, peasant women in Anatolia always covered their heads, but they tied their scarves in a certain way. Now what you see is this tight Iranian. So this is an import from Iran. This is making a political point. And I mean, I wouldn't like to. I can't speak on behalf of every woman that wears the veil. I mean, I have long arguments with very good Turkish politicians, good friends, who will say, "Oh, Geoffrey, I don't know why you get." So I put down amendments, by the way, against the veil and all this sort of stuff when we're passing resolutions on Turkey. Geoffrey, I don't see why you have such a problem with this. You know, my wife is veiled, it's her decision, she wants to do this. Well, I don't know. In some cases, I'm sure, in some cases it is. But you see, when you say modesty, when you even see the face and you see all the wonderful makeup and the eyeshadow and all the rest of it, I mean, you know, you're attracted to look at that. So I don't quite get some of
There's a
this.
balance between freedom of expression and duress. You know, you can't, it's hard to tell. And my friend does not veil. She's a doctor and she does not wear veil. She's very westernized. But she said she cannot advance any further in her career just because she's a woman.
Well, we have a very close friend, old friend in Ankara, who is a constitutional lawyer, and she loves Ataturk, Mustafa Kemal. She goes to the mausoleum there, praying to him. She said, if it wasn't for Mustafa Kemal, I would be walking 10 paces behind my husband, I would be wearing a veil, I would not be a lawyer, I would not have been educated, I wouldn't have any of these things. So I think it's a very difficult one, but I don't think we want to be misled by those that just say it's a freedom of choice issue. I don't think it is. And I think the other thing is that once you get girls into the universities and things who are veiled, there's then pressure on the other ones. And they will come up to them and say, so why are you not? Or else the father in the mosque will say to the father of the, why is your daughter not covered? And so the pressure develops in that way. And I think on the one hand, we're talking about cultural assimilation in our societies, and they was asking about, you know, why is it difficult in Germany to assimilate people? Well, I think, you know, once you put that as a barrier to assimilation, France, as you know, has just banned the veil. This has proved very controversial. Some would say the European Union, in terms of its advocacy of religious freedom, which for the European Union means looking after Christian heritage in Turkey, actually for many Turks it means, you're right, you can get the old veil on all these people. And some, you know, put the army back in its box because, you know, in all our societies, civil control of the military, requirement of entry to the European Union, but the army's been this great bastion of secularism. So, you know, we have all these countervailing tendencies which are going on, but I think the veil one, and there's some good books written on this, but I think this is a very important issue, and trying to get our attitudes right on it, I think it's extremely difficult. I think two quick ones. Yes, sir.
A lot of the reservations in the United States about Turkey today revolve around Ankara's relationship with Tehran, and plus all of the other factors that we mentioned. That particular one is, and as we have tried to develop sanctions to apply, the Turks are not cooperating yet. And that's the image that we have. Can you comment about this?
Yes, well, Iran has a Kurdish population. There's a community of interest there, if you like. Iran has provided oil and gas in the past to Turkey. Turkey needs these sources. I mean, don't forget that there is a border with Iran. Maybe Turkey can be helpful in terms of the relationship with Iran. We've had this recent example over the nuclear development in Iran, and many accuse the Turks and the Brazilians of not being helpful in this regard. Well, I mean, I think they read it slightly differently. So I think it's just yet another reason why we have to be more sensitive to Turkish interests and give them the benefit of the doubt that perhaps they are on our side, but they just see the world slightly differently. So,
There was a history of military intervention in Turkish governments if the government veered too far one way or the other. What's the likelihood of that now? I think they arrested a bunch of opposition in the past year or two.
you know, we had military coups in 1960, 1971, 1980. I mean, if things started to go off the rails a bit, I mean, the army sees itself as the bastion of the unity of the state and of secularism. And so if you saw, for instance, Kurds who want to break up the unity of the state, or Islamists that want to deviate from secularism, in the past the army would come in and say, time we had a little word, I think things are going a bit in the wrong direction. And of course they hanged the Prime Minister after the when Menderes was hanged when the army came to power. The army is different today. I think as one of the consequences of this accession process to the European Union, the army's had a lot of its teeth pulled, and I don't think it has the traction that it had in the past. And there is some concern that in the lower ranks of the officer corps there might be some people now with different tendencies. But I don't think it's quite the power that it was, but